Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today for this great earthday.org webinar on Can We Reverse Climate Change by Rebuilding Organic Matter. My name is Nate Bird. I'm Vice President of Trust in Food, the Social Impact Division of Farm Journal. And with me today is a tremendous lineup of panelists. I'd love to go ahead and introduce them and then dive into our questions. We will be taking questions live today. And so if you have a question, please type it in and let us know, and we'll make sure to reserve time at the end of our discussion today for that Q&A. Joining us today are Bradford Baker, professor at Georgia Institute of Technology, also a farmer and rancher and with the Southern Farm Lab. Julia Collins, founder and CEO of Planet Forward. Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for being here. John Piatti, president and CEO of American Farmland Trust. Great to see you, John. Farmer Rishi Kumar, a farmer and educator. Thank you, Farmer Rishi. Felipe Vilela, founder of Renature and Forbes 30 Under 30. Thank you so much for being here, Felipe. And then last but certainly not least, Jillian Seaman, Director of Food and Environment for earthday.org. Thank you so much, Jillian, for pulling together this great conversation today. Let's dive into the questions. And the first question is for you, Jillian. Earthday.org's theme for 2021 is Restore Our Earth. Can you talk a little bit about how regenerative agriculture falls in this year's theme and how it can potentially reverse the climate crisis?
Sure, yes, and thank you so much, Nate, for moderating this discussion. I'm so excited. There's such a wealth of knowledge on this panel. So yes, our theme this year is Restore Our Earth. And when I think of restoring our Earth, it's such a fitting theme for this year. But when I think of restoring our Earth, I immediately think of soil degradation and regeneration. And that's why at earthday.org, we've really made sure that we bring regenerative agriculture to the forefront of our campaigns. We can't continuously talk about the climate crisis without addressing animal and industrial agriculture, as animal agriculture and industrial agriculture have both played a major role in our climate crisis. About a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from land use and agriculture combined. And what we're seeing is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has reached the highest level in human history. And plants now can draw down the carbon and restore the soil's organic carbon content. I know for some of our viewers today that regenerative agriculture may be a new term, but I want to be very clear in saying this is not a buzzword, it's not a trend, it's what we really need to focus on to reverse the climate crisis. Regenerative agriculture, I'd like to explain it as kind of organic plus. It's a system of holistic farming practices and principles that really seeks to rehabilitate and enhance our entire ecosystem by really focusing on soil health. When we talk about farming practices and regenerative practices, we talk about no-till cultivation and cover crops and crop rotation and really keeping the carbon in the soil where it builds over time. Conventional agriculture has the effect of, has the opposite effect. It really destroys our soils by plowing and using synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides. What we're seeing is that industrial agriculture is really, our cropland soils are losing a significant amount of organic carbon content. And so, you know, what we're really like to focus on is farmers who are using these practices and seeing their soil carbon level rise significantly, which is happening by adapting these practices. And not only are we seeing more crops that are healthier, what we're seeing is our crops being more resistant to drought and stress factors. And you know, I just want to stress by working with nature, regenerative agriculture really does have the power to reverse climate change by not only increasing biodiversity, but by also restoring soils that have been degraded by years of industrial farming.
Thanks so much, Jillian, for that perspective and really setting the stage for what are the possibilities of regenerative agriculture. And I want to go now to Bradford. Bradford, building on what Jillian shared, what are the largest barriers in your view to regenerative agriculture under our current food system? And are the barriers the same whether you're looking at rural or suburban or urban communities?
Yeah, thank you for that question there. So I'm a behavioral ethics professor at Georgia Tech. My stream of research focuses on, interestingly enough, what I call the kind of psychological barriers to entry for farmers to approach this work from an ethical or a moral perspective. So what is preventing them from getting there? But I want to, through the research that I've done and, growing up as a farmer, working now as a farmer, talk what I see as kind of the three high level barriers there. Number one is, our assumption, what we believe is we only have about 30 harvest cycles left in the US on most of our cropland before we will be unable to produce food using conventional farming methods. Some soil scientists say 20 years, some say 60. We're in kind of the 30-year camp. So, most of the folks tuning in right now, this in our lifetime, we are facing a massive soil crisis. So even if we survive climate, which we have about 10 years for, we also have to solve for soil. And interestingly enough, symbiotically, by healing soil, we also, fix climate. But there's what I've noticed both among the general population as well as farmers is there's a general lack of awareness of that kind of ticking time bomb that we are facing. So a lack of awareness around that kind of 30-year mark, 60-year mark, 20-year mark, whatever you want to call it. Barrier two is, and this is not to throw, small scale farming under the bus. Our farm here is 105 acres, but we only have 5 in, crop production. Small scale farming is great. It's where we get our food from at the, farmers market that we can't grow here, but that is not the solution. We need, farmers like I grew up, my family farmers that are doing 5,000 acres to adopt these methods. And there are a multitude of challenges to bringing in, regenerative ag needs to be almost radically accessible to conventional farmers, inviting them in, having them participate in adopting and implementing these practices. So we need to get this adopted en masse as quickly as possible. And there's a multitude of barriers to that work. And it's some of the work that we're trying to do here. At Southern Farm Lab is figuring that out. Rodale Institute does amazing work around that as well. So the third barrier though, and I think this is the really critical one, and to me it's the most important, is regen ag needs to go through what we describe almost as a truth and reconciliation process. So most regenerative practices that are used today are actually African and indigenous. So these practices originated there. They, in many ways, have been stolen from those communities and repackaged as regen. And now, it's being sold out and done in this way. Conventional chemical-based farming was anchored in, land theft, white supremacy, colonialism, all of these systems of oppression. It's not just the chemistry of that farming that caused the problems that we're in today. It was those ideological histories that it was very much anchored in. If regen ag does not go through a truth and reconciliation process to account for what it is anchored to as well, and the fact that it is using indigenous and African practices, repackaged differently, it is going to create the same problems that synthetic chemical-based farming caused. And so it, as a system and a practice and a belief system, whatever it is, it needs to go through that process. And that is equally important if it is to solve for soil and to solve for climate, is that it is doing that justice-based work as well. And in terms of the urban, rural, suburban, I'm out of time. That's a whole other conversation. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bradford. Well, you've outlined some really key core issues that have to be solved, and it can almost seem overwhelming, but I'm confident that in the course of this conversation, we're at least going to identify some next steps that those in our audience, whether you farm or not, can begin taking. So thank you for setting the stage and identifying some of those really systemic challenges that we face when it comes to making regenerative ag normalized across America. Felipe, let's turn to you next and ask, in what ways can we measure how regenerative a farming system is, right? We have to be able to quantify that to say, here's where we are today and here's where we want to go. Are there fixed guidelines for what makes a farm or a farming system regenerative?
Perfect. Thanks, Nate, for the question, and it's a pleasure to be here to see all of you and discuss such a high important topic for the urgent times we're living. So I'm the founder of For Nature, working with regenerative agriculture and agroforestry around the globe. And responding to your question, there's quite a different ways of measuring how regenerative a farming system is. And a lot from that, Yilian and Brad already mentioned as well. So for sure, like one of the main elements is like to empower farmers to become less dependent on external inputs, because we see that today, you know, there's a heavy amount of like use of this external inputs, not only coming from the agrochemical, inputs, but also from organic inputs. So that's why we always plant regenerative system that has species that it can provide highest loads of biomass and organic matter in the design so that the farmer can depend less from these external inputs. So for instance, in the tropics, we use a lot of glycosides, bananas, eucalyptus in the rows with the species we plant. And then we can use these crops to, as a cover crop, but also as a way to make wood chips so that you can use that to fertilize the soil. And then we have systems that are already fully 100% independent from any external input. And for me, that's what means regenerative. It's for us to become less and less dependent on these external inputs, because we're always mining resources from other landscapes, and we cannot, we cannot pay this price in the long term. And of course, how we measure that is through many ways. So that's one of them. So keeping always soil covered is so key, important for that. Also increase crops diversification. So we always diversifying the farm so they can also tackle the challenges of pest control and diseases. So we do plant species that can bring more biodiversity so that we can restore also the biodiversity cycle. And one of the elements that I see also very important in the regenerative agriculture field is to not exclude the fact that we need to ensure food security for farmers as well. Because I know a lot of farmers working with, they claim to be regenerative, but they're still growing monoculture agriculture, and with it's just organic. And then they basically purchase food from from the groceries, from the industrialized food, and then they start getting sick, and their children, they don't get motivated to keep farming. And I think it's so crucial for us to include food security in the design process of regenerative agriculture, because I think we should be able to eat the food that comes from our own ground, right? And then aside from that, of course, the knowledge exchange. So it is more knowledge intensive, regenerative farming. And that means that there's a need for exchanging between farmers on this knowledge. So this interaction is very key. And of course, the economic viability. If it's not economically successfully the farm, then the farmer will not adopt it and will not scale that. So it has to be financially viable, and the financial viability can come from multiple ways: from the farm's resilience in the system to avoid floods and droughts. It can come from payment for ecosystem services. Now, for example, we are getting access to a carbon price of 20 euros per ton in a partnership with Rabobank. So this is really high quality carbon price for farmers transitioning towards regenerative ag. And then, of course, also with diversifying crops. So instead of only having coffee, as a monoculture with full sun, you have African mahogany, you have bananas that give some shade, which is good for the coffee in the growth. And then you also have the pulp and paper industry taking a role in the regeneration of this design, because then you're sourcing the coffee to a coffee company, but also the timber to a pulp and paper company. So we can bring collaboration between multiple stakeholders into the same land regenerated. And so that's why I think these are factors that contributes to measure regenerative, because we should be very careful with now how regenerative agriculture are being defined. And I say that because Yeah, like I think we this mindset of monoculture is really what is massing, landscapes. So I really think we should diversify our farms and keep soil covered and make sure that we can have yeah, fertile landscape for our future. So yeah, that's my contribution for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Felipe. And you're really speaking my language when you talk about farmers teaching and encouraging other farmers to become more regenerative, thinking about the economic benefits and the other sort of co-benefits that exist, not just the environmental impact to the land. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts and your experiences. Let's turn now to John Piatti. And John, a lot of attention goes to small, diversified regenerative systems. Bradford spoke about this earlier, but the reality is that the vast majority of acres are for large scale production, at least here in the United States, certainly. As an organization that has been promoting soil health for 40 years, how do you and your team at American Farmland Trust think about navigating that and creating opportunities for a diverse agricultural system, inclusive of all production types and sizes?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really a critical question. But before I talk about how, I just want to put a point on the why. And Jillian and Bradford both alluded to it. It's because we have to, right? I mean, this is critical for our future. We cannot afford to not implement these kind of practices on our land, not only so we can have the food that we need, but that we can begin to heal the planet. So it's critically important that we do these things. If that's true, we cannot afford to not engage every farmer in this effort. And an American Farmland Trust, and has been a challenge over the last 40 years, because it's very difficult to walk down that line and say to our friends who are small scale organic farmers, there is also a role for the 10,000 acre corn and soy farm in Indiana in this space. But it has to be inclusive. And if you just look at the numbers, if you really are looking at better practices to sequester carbon, you have to be doing that over large acreage to get the impact that you want. At the same time, smaller scale operations have a chance to go further, and they have really been in many ways the proving ground of some of these techniques. Bradford's absolutely right. There's nothing, AFT has been in this space for 40 years, but many of these practices are centuries old. We may have refined them a little bit. We may have better measuring right now, but these have been developed and refined by individual farmers, often on small plots. So there is a role for the small farmer here, because that's where the innovation can potentially come from. That's where we can really learn. That's where we can go further. And the good news is that regenerative practices also provide an opportunity for smaller farmers to be successful. What Felipe was saying about reducing the need for external inputs, that's important for all farms and important for the planet. But to the extent that small farms can reduce their need for external inputs, that proportionally is more helpful to them than a lot of large farms, right? So small farms not only have a critical role to play here, but they also have an opportunity to be successful more than they can in an industrial system. But the larger farms, if we want the impact that we want and need for our planet, they have to be actively engaged as well. What we say at American Farmland Trust is that every farm can do better by the environment. Everyone can do better by the land. It's a matter of getting the farm to move in the right direction, and we need everyone. Bradford also said something about mindset here, right? That we have to approach this differently. I think that's so critical. This is about approaching the subject of regenerative and our future as a species with humility and with inclusion and with an open mind. We can't villainize any farmer. We have to realize that they are all trying to do the best they can for their land within the system that they are given. And our job is to change that system so that they can be successful while also doing what's necessary for the planet.
Absolutely, John. Well, thank you so much for setting that up and really, again, emphasizing the importance of mindset and the fact that everyone has a role to play in this regenerative world that we are moving toward quickly, and that more people have the opportunity to engage in. So thank you for those words. I'm going to turn next to Julia. Julia, you've spent your career building food companies, and with Planet Forward, you're on a mission to tackle climate change by making it easier to bring climate-friendly products to market. Can you tell us how regenerative practices play a role in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, just building on this thread, Nate, everyone has a role to play. And at Planet Forward, we're really interested in the role of brands and in the role of consumers as very powerful agents in terms of climate actions, and agents with, frankly, a lot of responsibility. We have responsibility as individual consumers and as folks who are running brands in the food system to really be agents for change. So at Planet Forward, what we do is we help brands to amplify their positive climate impact by kind of unlocking a universe of more climate-friendly ingredients. What we did first was actually to create our own brand. And we wanted this to be a proof point for what a radically climate-friendly food product could look like. So we started first with our supply chain. We source our wheat directly from Dave and Serena Headland, 4th generation family farm in Skagit Valley, Washington, using practices like cover cropping, livestock integration, no-till, and really have like decades long records of how they've been able to improve soil organic matter over time, you know? And then we thought about our supply chain. So Dave and Serena grow our wheat, and then the wheat travels 1 mile down the road to our friend Kevin at Karen Spring, where he mills it. And then that flour travels 85 miles down the road to Kara and her team at Partners, where they bake it. And so we really wanted to model for food brands what a radically climate-friendly product would look like, starting with the supply chain. Regenerative agriculture has such an important role for us, you know, obviously because, as Jillian mentioned, you know, 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to land use and farming. And gosh, there's no silver bullet to the climate crisis, but it really seems to me, and I think to all of us here, that addressing our food systems is a really good place to start. And as Bradford mentioned, you were really building on African wisdom, on indigenous wisdom. And we're calling this, you know, the regenerative agriculture movement, and I'm totally at peace with that. But really recognizing that when we can tie back to some of the ancient wisdom around being connected to our land, I think that's the kind of spirit, that's the kind of mindset that John mentioned that really can carry the movement forward. So why do I get excited about the relationship between climate action and regenerative agriculture? Well, it's because we can restore the health of our soils. We can restore the natural carbon cycle. We can not just address, you know, how to get to net zero emissions, but also draw down and address the legacy load. And so what we're really trying to do at Planet Forward is empower consumers and empower brands to take their part in the movement.
Excellent. Julia, thank you so much for that great context, and also really emphasizing the importance of engaging hearts and minds in this process, because at the end of the day, it's not just about growing food. It's not just about fixing one link in the supply chain, but it's truly about a movement and helping people understand that the legacy we're creating through regenerative and through some of those production traditions that have been around for centuries, as you and John and Bradford pointed out, is something that we can all be extremely proud of, but also give voices that have previously been marginalized or overlooked a real central stage in transforming our food system. So thank you so much for that. Would love to turn to Rishi now. And Rishi, one of the questions that we had for you was, you know, our climate is going through dramatic changes every year. In your view, does regenerative agriculture represent a dramatic enough change in how we farm to counteract the imbalances in our climate?
Hey, Nate, yeah, thank you for the question. Short answer, no. The regenerative agriculture as we practice it today does not represent a dramatic enough change. You have to remember that regenerative agriculture, you know, as we see it today in Western cultures, is just the first time. It's like the first step that our cultures are taking, where we're starting to come into a relationship with our earth that is not one of rape and pillage. You know, that's been the overarching way that we have related with our earth that these cultures have related with earth for hundreds of years. And now they're starting to learn from indigenous cultures, as we've been mentioning. We're starting to learn from indigenous cultures, from African cultures, from Black American culture, about how we can actually have a loving and caring relationship with Earth. And I hear all these some of these statistics that we've thrown out today about 20% of climate change comes from agriculture. I like to say 100% of climate change comes from a culture that doesn't view the Earth as living, that still ranks people based on their skin color or their hair texture. So unless we start to, regenerative agriculture in terms of its practices, cover cropping, no-till, yeah, these things are important. But unless we start to address, the deep cultural shifts that need to take place, changing our practices, like Bradford said, is just going to lead us to the same place. I do want to push back actually on John and Bradford's contention that we need huge, large-scale landowners to change the way that they farm. We do need large-scale change in the way that the majority of our land in this country is taken care of. But again, I would ask us to look towards indigenous cultures, not just in how they farm, but around the systems that they create that result in their farming practices. So as we all know, private property is not a law of Earth. It's not a God-given thing that we should have private property. And especially, when we're talking about agricultural lands, like, do we need to have one person who owns 10,000, 100,000 acres of land and be reliant on them to make these shifts in their farming practices? We don't need to do that. We as a culture need to decide that, yes, these dramatic shifts are happening in our climate. And we need to start looking at dramatic shifts in our culture and how our culture expresses itself through the economy, through politics, and through the way that we relate with each other, right? Indigenous cultures manage their land collectively. I think that's something that we need to seriously take a look at. And also want to remind you that, in this time of COVID and quarantine, a lot of things that we thought were impossible have become possible. And I think it's starting, all of these kind of wake up calls are asking us to remember that, all these things that we thought were fixed, that we thought were absolutes and we thought were true, they're not. These are systems that were created. A lot of times they're systems that were created to oppress people, and we need to break out of these systems. And I would just remind people, for those of you who are new to regenerative agriculture, just a little bit of a history lesson from the perspective of indigenous peoples. The Amazon rainforest, there's now a lot of studies that are occurring that are showing that a large part, or even a majority, of the Amazon rainforest is actually a garden where people have been intimately engaged in the creation and the maintenance of the Amazon over millennia. The Everglades in Florida, Everglades are actually a giant garden planted by people. They planted forests which captured silt coming down rivers, which created the land, which actually created the southern portion of the state of Florida. America used to have an entire forest of chestnuts covering the eastern seaboard, an orchard planted by the indigenous peoples of America. The most productive agricultural system in the world is Hawaiian taro farming. Hawaii used to have as large a population in pre-colonial times as it does today, and they fed themselves completely with food that they grew. Today, Hawaii imports 95% of its food. So indigenous agricultural practices are so extremely productive, so extremely fine-tuned, and they've been fine-tuned over millennia. We can't have the hubris to say that we are now improving on them now with science. We are just making a first small step. We need to actually listen to and hear from our indigenous peoples, look to them for leadership, and we need to start to really look at making broad scale, deep changes in our entire culture.
Rishi, thank you so much for that great, helpful perspective, and also, again, challenging a lot of the perhaps the norms or status quo that a lot of us think about, and really opening our minds to the possibilities that exist as we're examining how to operationalize regenerative ag and make it accessible for more people. So thank you for that. Building on your comments, I'd like to turn to John next and ask, Black and Latino farmers are the most systematically underrepresented group in agriculture, yet make up a large percentage of farm workers. So what is American Farmland Trust doing to bring Black and brown farmers to the forefront of their regenerative revolution? And how can we make regenerative farming more equitable and economically accessible for all farmers?
Yeah, great question. And I'd add Indigenous to that list as well, another terribly underserved population. I'll be very frank, American Farmland Trust has tried through our entire history to work in this space. And yet it's a challenge, and I'll be very direct and honest about that. We find ourselves doing it where we can in really three main ways. One is partnership. I mean, we know we're an organization that grew out of white privilege. I mean, we were founded by the wife of one of the richest men in America, Peggy Rockefeller. We have benefited as an organization from charitable contributions and land gifts from a very well-to-do population. So we recognize that partnering with entities that really understand these issues better is something that we can do. And so we've worked with the Black Family Land Trust, we've worked with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, we've worked with the 1890 institutions. We do those kind of things where we can, but we've also tried with our own programming to move in this direction. I think we have some successes, not nearly everything that we over time want to do, and certainly not what we need to do. But for instance, we do direct grants to farmers. We had a farmer relief fund resulting from some of the challenges direct market farmers were experiencing because of the pandemic. And close to 30% of our funds there flow to underserved farmers. We have a partnership right now with Tillamook Creamery, and of the first batch of 130 grants there, I think 60 or so are going to BIPOC farmers. And then in our own programming, when we're maybe doing training around regenerative ag or the like, we really put an emphasis on wherever we can, supporting underserved populations. It depends on where we're operating. In California, for instance, we do a lot of work with Hispanic farmers. We actually have a Spanish language radio program to help share information about better farming practices and the like. And then the third area we're engaged in is policy. As you know, Nate, a lot of what American Farmland does is around agricultural policy. And there are opportunities there, whether it's programming directly supporting underserved communities, or if it's about beginning farmers, or even issues of tax policy. All of these, you can wear the lens of how it might better serve populations that have historically been at the short end of the stick. And we keep that very much front and center in our mind. And it would not be appropriate for me to be here representing American Farmland Trust and not talk about land protection, since that's a big part of what we are known for. And I would say that efforts to permanently protect farmland with a well-structured agricultural conservation easement is a means of lowering the cost of entry to new farmers and significantly, and that is one of the greatest barriers. I loved hearing Rishi's comments about different models of ownership, cooperative and the like. I think that's great. I've actually spent some time in my career helping groups of farmers access land. But many farmers want to own land themselves, and it's a huge barrier to entry, particularly for underserved farmers. So to the extent that AFT has helped create both state and federal funding sources for land protection, we found that that's a very meaningful way of helping some of these underserved populations. We're doing a number of things, but as I noted at the outset, Nate, we're all grasping with the challenge here, and it is a real challenge. And I come back to what, again, Bradford set up, and I reinforced this notion of mindset. We have to look at new structures. We have to be careful and not victimize anyone in the process of bad farmer versus good farmer. But we also really need to look hard at ourselves and the privilege that many Americans, and particularly white Americans, have experienced, and how that has had a negative impact on allowing Indigenous and Black populations from really playing the role in agriculture that they'd like. But we need to correct that.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thank you so much. And speaking of the sort of the magnitude of the challenge, I'm going to turn to Felipe next and ask, sort of moving up the farm gate and further down the supply chain, what is the business model for implementing regenerative systems, Felipe? And how do we convince companies to implement this in their supply chains?
Perfect. Thanks, Nate. I really love the diversity here in this group. And I really like to hear Rishi comments on the indigenous knowledge, because also the reason why I got into regenerative agriculture is because I went to the Amazon and I learned with the indigenous communities on how they preserve the forest to produce their own food, fibers, and medicine. And I was shocked by how much knowledge and respect there is for, for nature while producing all these goods. And I think, this is so important and key. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, Rishi. And also, I really like what John's mentioned as well, like with the whole work that it's needed to do this, organization, like which you bring collective investment towards fostering regenerative agriculture. And I think this kind of fundings and grants for projects which needs pre-finance is key. And so that's really great to hear. But answering your question, and yes, there's quite a substantial amount of business case going towards regenerative agriculture, and that's the main work we are doing now, because basically we're mostly focused on the major cash crops commodities causing deforestation and land degradation worldwide now. So we're looking at palm oil in Malaysia, looking at cocoa in Ivory Coast, looking at cattle and coffee in Brazil. So we are creating model farms that shows how economically viable it is to use a diversified regenerative system. So just to give you an example, for instance, we work with coffee in Brazil, and this system use coffee shaded by bananas, macadamia, African mahogany, and you use peanuts as for biomass ground cover. And what's interesting is that with all this diversification, you can pay the implementation cost in the third year by selling the bananas when you can harvest them. So you can pay the implementation cost with the bananas, which gave shade to the coffee, that gives higher quality over the long term. And then, with the overall hectare, you can make 2 times 0.6 more profit from the conventional coffee plantation that comes from monoculture. So by diversifying your farm, by creating this, resilience with the system, and also by payment for the carbon sequestration, you can actually really have a more financially viable system. So this is not only being done with coffee and the tropics, this has been also done in US and Europe. So I think there's quite a substantial amount of cases going this direction. But the reason why we're really targeting these major cash crops commodities that are causing deforestation is because, yeah, we really want to drive, showcases that can prove that we can reconcile the forest ecosystem with the land, with agriculture. So that's why we use a lot of agroforestry practices, for instance. And which is very interesting because also with palm oil, it has shown that it's 40% more productive to have agroforestry palm oil than monoculture. And you see, like in Malaysia and Indonesia, how much deforested landscape there is for all these large corporates. But the good news is that all these organizations, they are realizing there is a must on changing. So, we are doing projects with Nespresso, for instance, with coffee in Brazil. We're doing projects with Lush Cosmetics in Africa, with aloe vera and moringa. And now, you see Unilever, Nestle, Timberland, Danone, all these companies moving towards this because, they do realize that farmers are being impacted, and they will eventually be impacted over the long term. The reason why Nespresso came to us is because they supply from 1,200 farmers in the Cerrado region in Brazil. And the Cerrado region is highly being impacted by climate change. It's completely drying out, so there's no rain anymore, which is the reason of that is because deforestation in the Amazon is not bringing any more rain to that region. So farmers, they are having a lot of challenges with water, and also nematoids, which is the disease on coffee plants. And this will only increase these challenges farmers are facing. So these companies, they are realizing it, and that's why they're willing to invest in it. And I think our role as professionals and the people who are working on this field in regenerative agriculture, we need to stand there, give their hands to support these organizations to go through this transition period. Because as Brad said, it's not going to go from 0 to 100. We need to, follow it, step by step in order to scale that in their supply chain. Because we're talking to companies that they don't even know where the palm oil comes from. So there's a whole traceability and transparency challenge there. So, I think it's time for us to also give the hands for not only these corporates to transition, but also like farmers who are really facing these challenges. So yeah, that's how I see. And yeah.
Great. Thank you, Felipe. That's really helpful context, and exciting to hear so many organizations really moving in this direction. To build on that, Julia, Moonshot Snacks are the first of its kind. What led you to the production of climate-friendly snacks? I know you maybe touched on this just a little bit ago, but talk about, with so many labels and different packaging, how can consumers understand their buying power and its effect on the planet?
I mean, I think for me, I've always been somebody who has such a beautiful relationship to food, mostly as a medium for sharing culture and for joy and for health. I've always thought of myself as like a plant-forward eater. But when I gave birth to my son a couple of years ago, and I started to hear these statistics around time, like these data around time, 10 years to really take action on climate, 30 years of farmable topsoil left. Really, things changed for me. And I thought, what does it mean to be a plant-forward eater? Okay, that's really about me, but maybe what I need to be is a planet-forward eater. Maybe I really need to be thinking about how I make my food choices and how I make my lifestyle choices, and how the accumulation of those choices either map to or don't map to the kind of world that I want to live in. And so I started to really just create this internal framework of accountability around myself. And I think what we're trying to do at Moonshot is to extend that framework of accountability and of action to everyone everywhere. There is a sea of complication when you're just putting your consumer hat on and you're trying to put yourself in the feet of a consumer who doesn't have access to all of the information that many of us have, that doesn't have all of the data on climate change, that doesn't have a deep understanding of regenerative agriculture, and you're just trying to make the right choice for your family. Sometimes you're working against economic pressures and you're just trying to make the most affordable choice for your family. It can be very challenging and difficult to sort through all of the certifications and the badges and the claims and understand like what's really good. I think the framework or the mindset that we want to introduce with Moonshot is that transparency is a really good proxy for trust. And so trying to get consumers to be able to ask the question to understand where the food actually comes from. If you're in a position of privilege where you can access a farmer's market, that's a really good place to be able to think about how to get food for your family, because there's transparency there. You can transact with the farmer. And what I see many brands doing in this next wave of sort of natural and organic foods, which is frankly very exciting. Many founders in this space are thinking first about the planet when they're thinking about creating their brands. But what's exciting about this next wave is that folks are really building on this framework of transparency to build trust with consumers. And I think that transparency is probably more important than the next certification or badge or claim.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Julia. That's really helpful. And, to continue the conversation, I would say that, Rishi, you talk a lot about healing through gardening and why our connection to soil and plants matters so much. So can you talk a little bit about why regenerating the soil has such an impact on human and planetary health?
Yeah, I'm an urban farmer. All my work focuses on urban farming and urban gardening, and getting people into the garden as a way to start to remember what your relationship to the earth is. A lot of us have been trained to believe that we are just consumers, and the only way that we can interact or participate in regenerative agriculture is through buying products of regenerative agriculture. Number one, that's an extremely discriminatory way of viewing regenerative agriculture, in that you can only participate through purchasing, and you can only participate through, and the only thing you can purchase is very expensive food. So what I like to introduce to people is that like I've said, I really don't care too much to talk a lot about carbon and carbon sequestration, because I see this more as a cultural change needing to take place, and that cultural change can happen in any area. It doesn't matter if you live in an apartment or a condo or a small home or in a rural area. Like, you can be part of this cultural shift, and you can do that. And one of the ways that you can do that is through gardening. And you can garden indoor plants, you can garden plants on your balcony. You can become you can start to shift your relationship to this earth away from consumption. And just so you know, if you look up the definition of consumption or a consumer, consume literally means to destroy. So when you're identifying yourself as a consumer, you're identifying yourself as a destroyer. And what I would like is for people to start identifying themselves as caregivers, as people who understand that they can relate to this earth in a loving and caring way, and see that, actually a lot of what we've been taught about our relationship to the earth is just sheer, utter BS. We're told every day that when we eat, the leftovers of what we eat are food waste, and that we need to throw them away. And that after we eat, the products that we produce, our urine and our poop, is human waste. And what you understand when you start to get into a garden is that it's not food waste, it's food gift. And you give that gift to your compost pile, you give that gift to your worms, you give that gift to your soil, and even your own waste. I pee on my plants every day. At our farm, we have a composting toilet, and it's not a waste. It's the gift that I give every day to the garden, to the earth. It's actually what binds me to the earth. It's the thread that binds me, that makes that relationship resilient and real. And so for me, I'm really not that concerned about how many acres go under regenerative agriculture. I'm more concerned about the soil that is in the form of people, and how do people view themselves, because this is, for me, a cultural shift that needs to occur. And I want people to know that they can participate in this wherever they are. You don't need to have 1,000 acres to engage in this. You can engage in any space. And you can even engage in just, learning how to form regenerative relationships with, with other people in your life, because a lot of us, don't know how to relate to people anymore. And that itself is a problem.
Thank you for that, Rishi. And I think, you and Julia both made some interesting remarks as it relates to, Rishi, you said moving from consumers to caregivers. Julia talked about moving from, using transparency as a proxy for trust. And I wonder, one of the questions we had for Bradford as we get ready for our audience Q&A is, what role does technology play in future regenerative agricultural systems? And certainly technology can be a resource for capturing that transparency that Julia referenced, and also help us quantify the kind of caregiving we're providing to these agricultural systems. So talk a little bit, Bradford, if you would, about the role of technology in regenerative ag.
Yeah, and I think the irony here is, I'm a professor at a technology school, Georgia Tech, but I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I think I'm going to talk about this in a way that some might not expect me to. Obviously, I think there's a role for technologies, such as automated, weeders, like almost like a Roomba for your yard, and it goes out and it weeds your field. And so, there's obviously a space for that. Technologies that, are consistently monitoring and capturing data around carbon sequestration and increases, around that every year. But, one of the things, Will Harris, he's a regenerative rancher here in Georgia as well. He said that, the best thing that a rancher can put on, on their animals is their eyes. And the best thing a land steward can put on their land is their feet. And so my fear of technology is that if it further removes us from time that we're spending, is some silver bullet remedy to just solve, like, oh, we just put this thing in the field and I don't have to be out there anymore, it's just going to take care of it. It's another barrier between us and being on, being in relationship with land, being on land. So that's my fear of technology in that way. I actually think that the strongest way technology is going to play a role in regenerative ag is similar to some of the stuff that actually Rishi has brought up, is around cultural change. So we need to understand the technologies that, we might not look at it, it's not an iPhone, so we don't look at it as technology, but the technologies that led to land theft, the technologies that led to exploitation, the technologies that go into false food prices, the exploitation of labor. Like, these are technologies that created these systems and that have created these cultures. And so, going back to the point that I made at the beginning, I think for regen ag to be successful, we have to come up with new technologies that allow us to coexist with each other, with our land, and that are deeply rooted in an ethic of healing, not just soil, but healing relations and healing histories. We have to have technologies that allow us to do that, because if we just focus on how much soil organic matter we have, we ignore the history of how we got to this moment. And, regen ag has an opportunity to create those reparative, reparations-based histories in the form of technologies that allow us to get to that moment. And that's where I think actually technology plays the biggest role with regen. It's not, automated, harvesters. It's the technologies for culture creation that is rooted in reparations, and it is rooted in healing.
That's fascinating, Bradford. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective on this, rethinking how we use technology and for what ends to really offer healing and offer community as we think about these regenerative systems. I want to move to I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I want to give a chance for some audience questions. So I'm going to just pose these to the group, and if you want to raise your hand or unmute yourself and respond, I would love for you to do that. The first question we have comes from Veronica, and it is, how can we make the transition from our farming system today to broad scale regenerative ag? And I think we've talked about this quite a bit today, but would love additional perspective. And Veronica goes on to say, what are the biggest challenges? How can we support this transition? Who'd like to take that one?
I'll take a crack at that.
Please.
I know. I think to be really honest, like, we don't know. We don't know where exactly to go right now. I think you can't, one of the things I believe is you can't see beyond what you don't understand, but that doesn't mean that you don't start on a path, right? So we know I think we are all starting to understand what are the steps in front of us. And the steps in front of us are we need to come into a relationship of care and understanding with our planet. We need to start treating our planet as the living being that she is. We need to start treating all of the organs of our planet, all of the beings that make up this body as living beings. Like for me, I think that's number one. And what comes out of that is all these practices, on a daily basis in all of our lives. Yeah, but how does this all play out? I have some ideas. I do think we need a large scale land reform. I do think we need, large swaths of the population to understand that these are the changes that we need to make. But what are the exact steps? What's the exact order? If anyone says that they know that right now, I would say they're full of shit.
Farmer Rishi, we appreciate your candor. John, did you have something to add to what Rishi said?
Well, I used to address this issue frequently in public presentations, and I actually had a comment that would sound a little bit like what you've heard from some of the presenters today, which is I also don't have an answer. But if I had to choose something, it would be to have everyone try to have a deeper connection to the land and to growing and cultivation. And I think so many of our problems stem from the fact that we are a few generations removed from the farm and really don't understand how the systems work and how life grows. So I just wanted to reinforce that point again. I think it's spot on. Having said that, I do also think that markets have a role here, and I think that public policy has a role here, and we need to pursue every avenue. As important as it is for people to get more in tune with the natural environment and see the wonders of life, and we also we won't have a lot of time, and we need to explore a whole range of options with the humility that we don't know what the right answer is.
I would have to agree with that. For whatever reason, there's a huge disconnect between the food that we eat, the soil beneath our feet, and climate change. And trying to be able to make that connection is so imperative to what scientists are saying. We have less than 60 harvests left. So, and our topsoil is being degraded at such a high speed. So we as a people just need to make that connection. We need to use, and Julia had said this, we need to use our buying power, we need to use our voice, but we also need to make sure that we make that connection more, because we just don't.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Jillian, for those comments as well. That's really helpful. And again, that connectivity to the land is going to be so important as we move forward. Yeah, Carla asks, and maybe I'll throw this one to Bradford as someone with both a farming background. That is, will using regenerative agriculture have an effect on what we will be able to produce? Would it take away from the crops we have or produce more? Thoughts on that one, Bradford?
Yeah, so some of the statistics that I've seen, recently around this, I think it's like 75% of what we consume comes from like 6 different varieties of plants, basically. So we, the majority of our global diet has been very monocultured. It has been really reduced to a few key staples. Nature does not like homogeneity. It wants diversity. It operates in its healthiest ways in diversity. So it will, in terms of just it's not just the quantity that is going to be produced and increased through that, studies have shown, regenerative farming produces. There is going to be an increased variety there, but also increased nutritional density. And that's a really key thing here that we didn't talk a lot about on this call, but increased nutritional density when we talk about the harvest cycles and things like that, I mean, you can grow carrots essentially in sand, but you're basically just, you're eating orange water. There's almost no nutritional density to that carrot. And so it looks like a carrot, it tastes like a carrot, but you're not getting any of those healthy minerals that you need. So in terms of what regen does, as well as a method and an ethic, is it produces more nutritionally dense food. And that's a key thing that needs to be looked at as well. And I think one of the things that, we should be thinking about when we're food that we can't produce ourselves, that we are going out and buying, that we're looking at purchasing it from a perspective of what is the nutritional density of this as well.
Can I take a follow up on that too?
Please.
Yeah, so I think there's a huge misconception about where our food on this planet is grown. 70% of food grown is grown by small scale growers, peasant agriculture around the world. Most of the food that you eat is not grown by American industrial agriculture. American industrial agriculture primarily produces corn and soy, and that's primarily used for processed food, which you could argue a lot of that is not really food. And then a large portion of that is fed to animals or is used to make fuel or other industrial inputs. So, when you're going to the grocery store and you're buying fruits and veggies, a lot of those most of those, if you're not in California, are grown in California, and then the rest of them are imported from other countries where they could be grown by small scale growers. And a second point, we eat so few different types of, foods. Like we just eat like the same 7 or 8 vegetables every day. And every region of this earth has unique edible plants, has unique animals. And we just we have no clue about them, One of my favorite examples is, just because I love this fruit, is that there's a fruit that grows in the forest all across the eastern U.S. called the pawpaw. It's the most amazing, delicious fruit. I mean, it's in my top 5 of all fruits. Somehow I'm able to grow it here in Southern California too, and people literally don't know it. I mean, people have just been growing apples and pears when you got the pawpaw, which is like a mango banana custard. And we just forgotten about it because of industrial ag, because of this culture that prioritizes or preferences one people over another, one people's knowledge over another, one people's foods over another. And so part of this process of regeneration is just remembering and getting back in touch with what's right in front of us. And if you go out into your local hillsides or your local forests, you're going to find hundreds of edible plants that you never have heard of before. So,
Farmer Rishi, thanks for the comments. I have a pawpaw sapling growing in my yard, so I'm glad to hear. I hope the pawpaw makes a comeback as part of this conversation we're having today.
Killer.
I'm excited about it. Last audience question, and then I know we'll wrap up because we're about out of time. We're so grateful to all of our panelists and our audience for staying with us. The last question I'll pose to John and to Jillian, the pandemic has shown, John writes, the pandemic has shown the real possibility of local supply chains with urban food chains cooperate with local suppliers. Shouldn't this be a major aim of a regenerative program? John, I'll let you start and then finish with Jillian.
Well, the pandemic, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of Americans who had really never thought about their food supply. And it's maybe one of the few silver linings here, that people are thinking differently about some of these things. I think it's making them think that we don't want to have just-in-time delivery from California or from some big outfits. We want to have more production close to home. We want to have more resilient agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't belabor it except to make that point, that for people who have never thought about farming or agriculture before, when the supermarket shelves were empty, they began to. And I hope that this really becomes a driving force behind some much needed change.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think what we've seen over the last year is how resilient we are as people, but how our food system is not the same. And so I think it's imperative that when we're looking, I mean, you have thousands of people in lines at food banks, food banks that have run out of food, talking about, focusing on regenerative practices and bringing those into the communities. It's kind of hard to have that discussion when people don't have the food on the table. But if we were able to regenerate our lands and our food in a way that would increase our yield production, I think that would change the trajectory of those conversations. So we have to be really mindful of when we're talking about our food supply and where actually our food, where it's happening. So I think there's so much more to add to this conversation that we can't get to, but we really have to make that connection though, and know that our food supply has not been as resilient as people have been.
Absolutely. It's been a real learning opportunity for all of us and a chance to reconnect with food locally for many of you, I hope. Thank you, Jillian, and thank you, John. To wrap us up today, Bradford would love for you to give us a few closing thoughts, as we're thinking about this large, challenging, audacious topic of regenerative ag. There's so much opportunity here. It's really exciting to see the earthday.org team making this a focus of their work in 2021. What would you close us out with? What would you challenge our audience to be thinking about or doing to take the next step here?
Yeah, I mean, at least for audience members and folks here in the U.S. and even in Latin America as well, understand the indigenous land that you're on. I think that's really important. Understanding those histories. We're all on occupied land here in Georgia. We're on occupied Muskogee. I grew up on occupied Blackfeet land in Montana. So understanding those histories and anybody out there wanting to read an amazing book right now, Leah Penniman's Farming While Black, read that book. It's incredible. And follow Chris Newman at Sylvan Aqua Farms on Instagram. He's doing amazing work around, exploring what decolonial farming looks like. So those would be my closing shout outs and thoughts there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bradford. And I want to say thank you again to the team at earthday.org, their communications team. Halsey, thank you so much. Thank you to each of our panelists, to Jillian, to Julia, to John, Farmer Rishi, Felipe, all of you. It's been a real tremendous conversation. We want to thank again all of our audience. And for more information about the regenerative agriculture program and focus area at earthday.org, you can go to their websites and reach out to Jillian for more information. Jillian, any last words?
No, this was wonderful. Thank you all for joining. This is such an imperative discussion, and we're just, being an environmental organization and being able to really address industrial and animal agriculture in this way is really imperative in how we move forward and how we address climate change. So thank you, everyone. This has been a great discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.